Hey guys, welcome to the fourth and final video for chapter 32, where we're going to be talking about Iraq. Now, Iraq is a country right smack in the middle of the Middle East. It is a largely Arab country, almost entirely Arab ethnicity, although in the north you've got Kurds. We'll talk a little bit more about them. And it's also the site of the ancient Mesopotamia, right? The cradle of civilization. Think back to the very, very beginning of Global 1 of your freshman year when you learned about the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers and so forth. That's Iraq today. It is a almost entirely Muslim population, mixed population of both Sunni and Shiite, although Shiites make up a slight majority, which is going to be important for what we're going to be talking about next. So even though you have a Shiite majority, the government was controlled by Sunnis. Now in 1979, Iraq became a dictatorship under Saddam Hussein. Now, Hussein was technically a Sunni, but he was not a very religious person. He was all about control, regardless of faith or ethnicity. Fear kept everyone in line, and he was not above using brutal force to do so, such as when he used chemical weapons on Kurds in northern Iraq. You go up around here in the northern region of both Iraq, Syria, and even up into Turkey. And this region up here are the home of the Kurds. They're a separate ethnicity from Arabs. And they were not big fans of being ruled by a brutal dictator like Saddam Hussein, and they rose up against him, and Saddam dropped chemical gas on them, killed men, women, and children, wiped out entire villages. So for him, it was all about control, right? He was your typical totalitarian dictator. Now, Saddam's ambition to expand Iraq, it involved, expanding into Iran. Okay, its neighbor over here to the east, and this led to the Iran-Iraq War in 1980. Both sides attacked oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. That's this body of water right down here in the bottom right. And this resulted in huge economic losses for both nations. The U.S. didn't really get that involved in this war, at least not up front, but we got very involved with Iraq in the 1991 Gulf War. Okay, here you see Iraqi soldiers. This was in the Iraq War. You see Iraqi soldiers and the Ayatollah. I remember talking about him in the previous section, with bullet holes, obviously. They were taking shots at the picture of it. But the 1991 Gulf War, Iraq invaded the small nation of Kuwait. All right, here's Kuwait down here. I'm not sure why it doesn't circle the entire thing, but Kuwait blocks off most of Iraq's access into the Persian Gulf. Even though it's a small country, it's a very, very oil-rich country. So that definitely factors into Hussein's decision to invade, right? Saddam justified it by saying that Kuwait was always part of Iraq, but oil obviously had a lot to do with it. Oil also had a lot to do with the United States coming to the aid of Kuwait. We saw this as a threat to our interest in the Middle East, especially because they figured if Saddam was willing to invade Kuwait, the next move was him invading to the south into Saudi Arabia, which is one of our biggest economic allies in the region. This led the U.S., which, even though it was technically a UN coalition, it was really the United States, to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. Now, this led to a fairly quick war overall, although a lot of damage was done to oil fields. The Iraqi army, as it was retreating from Kuwait, it lit fires to these oil fields, and the fires, the spires from it, they were hundreds of feet tall. Some of them, it took a very long time for them to put out. So even though Iraq was defeated very quickly, Saddam stayed in power. Until at least the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, the 9/11 attacks led to moves by the U.S. to remove Saddam from power. President Bush claimed that Iraq had what we called weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction are nuclear, biological, chemical, anything like that that's capable of killing a lot of people. That's the reasoning that the U.S. government and the U.S. military gave for justifying going into Iraq after we invaded Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks. Plus that he was supporting terrorists like Al-Qaeda. Even though no truth was found to any of that, we invaded all the same. Now, Saddam was driven from power fairly quickly. Okay, only a couple of months after our initial invasion, President Bush makes his famous appearance on the aircraft carrier with mission accomplished in the background. He was eventually, his government was toppled. Here you have the iconic image of his statue being brought down. And he was eventually found. He went into hiding for a short amount of time, but he was eventually captured by U.S. forces and let the beard grow out while he was in hiding. And later on, he was put on trial by the new Iraqi coalition government. He was found guilty and he was executed by the Iraqi government, though, not by the U.S. government or the U.S. military. However, the problems were far from over with Saddam's removal. You had a tremendous amount of further violence after this. A brutal insurgency followed for the next few years. See, Saddam's removal destabilized Iraq, and violence ensued. Shiites had long felt disenfranchised under Saddam's rule and took out their anger and resentment against Sunnis. Both sides formed these militias, these death squads that would go into opposing neighborhoods and just start targeting and killing people. On top of this, many Iraqis, both Sunnis and Shiites, resented the occupying American military and waged a violent campaign of guerrilla attacks and bombings. And that obviously resulted in thousands of deaths and casualties of American servicemen and women. So even though we've technically left Iraq, we officially pulled out of Iraq in 2011, it still remains a hot spot since the emergence of ISIS. So that wraps things up for Iraq as well as the Middle East and this chapter. Hopefully what we take from it is that a lot of these issues, whether you're talking about ethnic violence in Africa or religious violence or, just the really, really messed up situation in the Middle East, these are very, very complex issues. They're not, I basically just gave you guys a surface introduction of it, and you could read books and books of this stuff and still maybe not really get to the heart of everything. But in any event, hopefully it gives you a better understanding of some of the conflicts that we have in the world today.